Hello and welcome to this session on driving the local recovery and renewal. I'm Naomi Clayton, Deputy Director at Learning and Work. So we know that in terms of the economic impacts of the pandemic, it's hit particular groups hard, including young people, and it's also had a huge impact on local economies across the country. We know that in many areas it seems to have hit poorer communities harder, raising the risk that we'll see a deepening of those inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic. So with the government looking to level up opportunity across the UK, we're going to explore the role of local government in driving recovery and renewal as the economy starts to open up. And just a few things before I hand over to our panelists. If I can ask all attendees to remain muted and keep your videos switched off during the session, that would be great. If you can also make sure that your Zoom ID lists either your name and or the organisation that you represent. Just a note to say that we'll be recording this event and we'll make it available after the event. As the panelists are speaking, can I just remind you to ask questions in the chat? So I'm going to pose a series of questions to the panelists in a slightly different order to the one that we've got on the screen here before opening up to questions. So I'm going to start with Paul, then go to Shona, then Michelle and Sarah. So yes, please do enter any questions or comments that you've got in the chat as the session runs. So Paul, if I can hand over to you to start off with. Paul, Director of Policy and Research at Centre for Cities. I know Centre for Cities has been tracking the impacts of the pandemic, and for a long time you've been looking at different aspects of local economic development. Can I ask you to talk a bit about what local areas will need to do to recover quickly, and what needs to be in place for a sustainable recovery too?
Great, thanks Naomi, and good afternoon everybody, and a great question. I think the first thing to do is which may sound obvious, but I think it may well get lost in perhaps some of the messaging from the government in the coming months, is to separate out recovery from a sustained long-term performance. And so if you could imagine, say, a place like Hull or Middlesbrough, who actually are sort of recovering sort of fairly well, or haven't been hit quite so hard as perhaps some other parts of the country, especially say places like Crawley and Luton, for example. Even if we see a fast recovery in a place like Middlesbrough or Hull, for example, that recovery back to that March 2020 position is not a satisfactory position for the people who live in and around those two areas. Because what we know is that both of those cities have struggled for many decades in terms of the types of jobs available, the number of jobs available, the wages that are in place. So even if we see a strong recovery or a quick recovery or perhaps a sustainable recovery back to March 2020, that's only getting us part of the way. And I think the real then question about sustainable recovery is then what you do from there, and that gets you into questions around levelling up. In terms of what it is that local government can do, and I'm sure that the other panelists will have more to say on this and more experience than me, but I think we know that we live in a very centralised country. There's actually sort of relatively few levers that I think local government can pull in the first place because they haven't been given the powers in order to do that. But also I think we're sort of responding to a crisis which is something where it does require national government intervention, because we effectively need a very large insurance net or a safety net to deal with the fact of the different types of the economy that have been hit and shut down as a result of what we've seen over the last 16 months or so. So that's why GRS has to be a national-led policy, for example, because it's just a massive safety net that I don't think local government could do, even if we did see a lot more devolution. That is the role for national government. But beyond that, there are, of course, things that local government can do with the powers they've got. I think that's around coordination and it's around delivery of things. It's about how do you try and use the funding that's available to divert that towards the people who need it the most. And so the question then is, who are those people? Well, we've got the GRS scheme changing as of today, with employers having to make larger contributions, and then allegedly ending in September. That's going to have implications in terms of people that may well be made unemployed as a result of those changes. And then you've got how do you identify them, and then how do you try and get them back into work with the money that's available and the programs that are already existing. And I think it's that targeting, identification and targeting, where local government can make that difference over the coming months, given the wider constraints that they have around the policy powers that they have.
Great. And obviously you talked a bit about the fact that so much of this is centrally driven, and that local authorities have relatively limited power to respond to some of the issues that the pandemic has thrown up, and some of the pre-existing challenges that local authorities have and local economies have faced. You know, with the kind of forthcoming devolution white paper, I think expected sometime later this year, what would you want to see within that to help local economies and partnerships respond to some of those challenges?
Yeah, and this gets right to the heart of, you know, if we do get back to pre-March 2020 levels, what is it that you then do? The government has definitely rolled back in terms of its devolution white paper. It's now the levelling up white paper, of which devolution will be a part of it. How much that will be there, it will be remain to be seen. And I think probably this time last year, civil servants were being quite ambitious about what the devolution offer was going to be. And the mood music now seems to be that that's not going to be the case. I think what we should be seeing, I think, is two forms of devolution. The first is levelling places up to the powers that London has benefited from for at least 2 decades now. So that's things around control of the transport system, spatial planning powers, bus franchising within the transport powers, and the other things that London has got, and allows them to sort of connect all the bits together, as well as having sort of powers over individual policy areas and pull them all together under the London plan. We should be seeing that given to other areas. There's no reason why London should have it. You know, one of the most successful cities in the world, and yet other places that are perhaps not quite so successful, not having the advantage of those same powers. Then the second form of devolution is not necessarily through devolution of power, but through giving control over the money that local government has. So it's moving away from 1-year budgets that have to be spent within a year. Sales fees and charges having to be spent in the same area that they're raised in. So if you raise money from car parking, it's got to be spent within transport rather than, say, on social care or other things, and given that much greater flexibility to be able to plan over the longer term, you know, have more certain funding over the longer term, and have more say over about how that money is going to be spent. Having said that, there's a lot of upside there, I think, for local government, but I think there is a bargaining chip here, in that if we are going to see that greater devolution of power, we do need to see a reform of local government as well. You know, we've got many hundreds of local government authorities already. We've got a mismatch, I think, of a number of different local authorities that cover just one city or one area. We've got 2-tier government in some places where economic powers are arbitrarily split between the two, and where it's not clear as to why that's the case. And I think if we want local government to make more of the powers it already has, never mind actually getting some of the powers that we want to see passed down, we're going to have to build stronger institutions. And the current form of local government doesn't lend itself towards that. And that's why I think we need to see local government reorganisation as part of this new deal for local government in terms of powers passed down and greater financial freedoms as well.
Great. Okay. So, you know, a few different issues there. Shona, if I can come to you next as somebody working on the ground in partnership with other local organisations. Shona is Head of Education, Employment and Skills at the Tees Valley Combined Authority. And, you know, it's an area that had relatively high levels of unemployment going into the pandemic and some long-running challenges. Can you tell us a bit about how the pandemic has impacted businesses and communities in Tees Valley?
Yes, thank you, Naomi, and I can. I think it's already been said that, you know, COVID-19 has had a severe and immediate impact on all aspects of the economy in Tees Valley. But there are sectorial differences and there are community differences, I think, in terms of what that impact has been. I think Paul made the point around, pre-COVID levels of unemployment and long-term deprivation in some of our areas, not just in Middlesbrough, but some of our other wards in our other local authority areas have been, have had significant long-term unemployment and, lack of investment, etc., for a number of years. However, I think what we've seen is that the impact isn't so much on geographical communities, it's actually been on personal characteristics. So it's been on the people themselves in terms of what their personal experience, their employment history, indeed what the characteristics of them and their families and their lifestyles are, if you like. And it kind of depended which sectors they were either employed in or looking to move into employment in as to how they have been impacted. And like many areas, Tees Valley has seen unemployment rise significantly, reaching a peak last May. And actually, we've seen a 40% increase in the number of universal credit claimants in our area, which obviously compounds that whole issue of long-term unemployment and economic inactivity pre-COVID. And that's really very concerning for us. If I just sort of split this a little bit and think about what the real community impact has been, I mean, I think young people and school leavers have been impacted significantly and disproportionately affected by COVID-19. They're more likely to have long-term damage that this might mean for this young group in our population. I mean, at the moment, our youth unemployment accounts for nearly 18% of our unemployment levels, and they were already high, as I say, before COVID hit. So therefore, it's at least a 5% increase on the national average. So really, our young people are really of concern to us. And obviously, we've got long-term unemployed and economically inactive. Pre-COVID, we had high levels, much higher than the national average of long-term unemployment. And our concern now is that they will be, again, severely impacted in a very competitive labour market. So employers will have the choice of more skilled, more experienced people than someone, for example, that has been long-term unemployed for maybe 2 years plus. And obviously, the longer people are unemployed, the greater the impact it has on them. And there's a less chance of them getting back into the career journey that they had planned originally. And therefore, we need to look at that in some detail. I mean, nearly 60% of our unemployment population is has been unemployed for more than 12 months at the moment. So therefore, really thinking about how do we help those people into work is going to be really important. And also alongside that, thinking about how we're going to help those people reskill into new sectors, because we will see and are already seeing movement of people who used to work in sort of hospitality, leisure, etc., actually moving into other sectors. And therefore, those sectors of hospitality and leisure are actually finding that they can no longer access those skilled personnel that were available previously. I think the other thing is that small business owners have been really impacted on this, and we have 90% of our businesses are SMEs, so therefore really that impact in small businesses has been much greater than larger businesses, is what we're finding. They have higher levels of uncertainty, I think, in terms of whether they will be able to survive, and indeed cash flow is a real issue for them, with many saying that they have 6 months or less available cash reserves for the businesses to draw on. I think consumer confidence is low at the moment as well, so therefore that impact on businesses and individuals to actually move into work or access support is quite high. Really, when I think about sectors in Tees Valley, obviously the most severely impacted has been the service-based sectors, the hospitality, the leisure, tourism, culture, etc. And we had a very vibrant leisure and culture sector, so therefore, we have seen a big impact on that. I mean, basically, it's threatened company viability, as you'd expect, and some businesses have not survived. But this also impacts on young people and female employment. So we found that those sectors were very good for giving entrance to the labour market work experience, and we were finding that young people used those as opportunities, particularly students, to gain work experience. So that impact on that particular part of the community has also been greater. We do have a continued concern in hospitality because we are seeing that they are struggling to fill a lot of the vacancies that they have at the moment. So again, trying to help that sector access a new labour market, if you like, is really important. We do have a number of sectors that have what we call rebounded and refocused their work. So in effect, they've managed to look at refocusing their manufacturing processes and indeed the products that they've been manufacturing. So they have been able to move with the requirements of consumers. And therefore, we have seen the construction and manufacturing sectors rebound quite well at the moment. We are also finding that those sectors are the strategic sectors for Tees Valley, so they are really sort of giving us the basis for growth in the future, which is what we would hope. In terms of recovery, we are seeing obviously some concerns from the health and social sector, digital and logistics, but actually we are seeing increased demand from those sectors now, and that we have got a high number of vacancies within those sectors. So we are finding that they are recovering and growing now. We are also seeing that in Tees Valley, we've got real opportunity. So we've seen about a 17% rise in the number of vacancies that we've got in the last 12 months, which is really primarily in the health and social care, digital and logistics sectors, but it's very much linked to the new development. So the Tees Works development site, which is the SSI Steelworks site that is really motoring now in terms of the demolition works, the groundworks, etc. And indeed, I think the inward investment commitments that we've now got are significant, and therefore that's giving us real hope and opportunity for the future. And that linked obviously to the free port announcements and also the clean energy sector growth that we're expecting. We expect that to see further growth. But if we sort of think about, I think you asked me a question around thinking about the role of local government. Yeah. And I think the real role of local government here, however you define that, so particularly combined authorities working with local authorities, it's really important that we work together to really support the national programme. So the Plan for Jobs, for example, is a huge opportunity for us in terms of the commitment that government has given us. However, I do think that the most important thing to make that work and to encourage people to access the support that's available is that joint local working, that collaboration between all agencies, all types of programme, project managers, etc., to try and align the delivery as much as possible, because it is very complex at the moment. I mean, we are seeing, many announcements from national government in terms of support that's available for skills and employment. But what we've got to really do is help people navigate through that system and help businesses who are recruiting and looking for a skilled workforce to navigate the system, because it is complex. And I think there's a danger at the moment that businesses and individuals step back and because they're unclear of where to go for that support, that they don't access the support that when they need it. Therefore, I think that's the role of local government, however you define it now. And I think that thinking about how we maximise all of the programmes that we've got in terms of the funding we've got available and the scope, if you like, that they have to deliver and the scale of delivery is really important. And take that a bit as a mantra to maximise existing programmes so that local government can look at where the gaps are and try and fill those gaps wherever possible. So it's really about complementing that national and local offer, I think. But I really like the point that Paul made around, multi-year funding and simplifying the system is how I'll briefly summarise what he said. And I do think that that's really important that we try and do that for businesses and our local people affected by COVID-19. So really, in a bit of conclusion, I would say that there's an absolute increase in the role of local government now, much more than there has been for some time, to really complement national policy, to implement all of those offers of support that are out there, and to ensure that that support gets to where it's really needed and will have that lasting impact. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Shona. So some positive signs with some of the kind of sectors and sites within Tees Valley seeing jobs growth and rebounding. but clearly a concern around the rise in long-term unemployment, and we've seen sharp rises at the national level, and particularly among young people who have been unemployed for 6 months or longer. And clearly, you know, there's this kind of scarring impacts of long-term unemployment that we want to try and avoid, the impacts on physical and mental health as well. And I think we make some interesting points about, clearly for individuals and businesses, it can be quite a complex system of support to try and navigate. And clearly there's a role for local government and local partners in trying to make those connections, make it simpler for individuals and businesses, and fill the gaps. Brilliant. Michelle, if I can come to you next for the view in London. Michelle is Assistant Director of Skills and Employment at the Greater London Authority. We know that London has been one of the hardest hit areas during the pandemic, partly because of the nature of its economy. Can you tell us a bit more about the impacts on London, Michelle, and what role you see the GLA and London boroughs playing in driving the recovery and renewal?
Thanks, Naomi. I mean, you've opened it there. I think London has been significantly impacted by COVID. I don't think there's any area of the country that's going to say it hasn't been significantly impacted. So it's always entertaining when we all compete with how badly we've been impacted. But I would say in London, we would argue, of course, that we have been impacted in a far greater way than other areas, and in perhaps a way that London would never have expected to be. London is always seen as the driver of the economy. We're seen as having huge wealth. The pavements of London are paved with gold. And I think what the pandemic has shown that simply isn't the case. We have an unemployment rate that is significantly higher than the national average, around 6.5 to 4.7% respectively over the last 3 months up to April 21. We have pockets of deprivation that are in the top tiers of deprivation across the country, but we do have some positives. I think there's two sides to London as well. The city and the West End have been impacted in a way that I don't think anyone could have imagined. If anyone has been into central London, it doesn't feel like the central London that you probably remember. The city is still dead, so offices aren't back in, people aren't there. And it's not just about the big financial centres that we're dragging people into offices, it's about the impact they have on the other industries that are set up around there. So hospitality, retail, none of that's back to where it was. We then look at the West End. Theatres are still shut or not able to open at capacity, and we're not attracting the levels of tourism that we would have expected. You know, we still do have no international tourism, and actually domestic tourism is significantly down as well, because people still have the view that London is this busy, dense place and therefore don't want to come in because of COVID. So London has been hugely impacted in terms of the centrality, and that is a really big focus of the Mayor and the London boroughs in terms of how do we attract people back into the central activity zone, that's central London, and how do we ensure that the large number of jobs that it has always generated are going to be there as we start to recover. We saw today, I think Gap is now closing all of its high street stores. Again, the retail options are changing significantly. That produced a lot of jobs in London. So significant concern there as well. Then we look to sort of outer London, and that has a slightly different picture, although parts of outer London have been impacted incredibly hard. If we look at Heathrow, the whole economy of West London is being significantly impacted by the reduced amount of travel that we're able to have there. So it's not just the central activity zone, actually it's a large part of West London and the surrounding infrastructure that goes around the airport, the jobs and the roles there. We also know that certain individuals, and going back to really what Shona has said, certain individuals have been impacted more by this, and those are the individuals that are probably the same across the rest of the country. But we know that young people have been significantly hit by COVID. Black and minority ethnic Londoners and those with caring responsibilities are feeling the effects of COVID far worse. We also know that and linking to some of the studies that have come out this week around health, deprivation and the impact of COVID, we know that Londoners have been affected in terms of population that have caught COVID and unfortunately died from COVID in a significant way as well. And you will have heard on the news the sort of push to get people vaccinated in London, the vaccine rates not being quite as high perhaps as other parts of the country. So, I mean, we have a significant challenge ahead, and probably a challenge that we never would have expected 2 years ago, to be talking about central London being dead, and how do we revive the economy in that way. However, I think there's huge opportunity, and one of the things that's come out of the pandemic for me personally has been the ability for the GLA, the mayoral team and our London boroughs to work together collectively on a response. And the mayor has set out with London councils, all of our boroughs, the recovery programme for the next few years. We have 9 areas of that we focus on, ranging from health and well-being right the way through to sort of good work and getting people into work. I would say as well, that's one of the other things we're focusing on, coming back to the long-term recovery. It's not just about getting people jobs, it's about getting them good jobs that are sustainable and that are paying the London living wage. So we're not looking to push loads of people just into work. We need those opportunities to be offering them good work and to create that sustainability and obviously improve their life and lifestyles moving forward, health, well-being and everything else to do with that. We've got a number of programs that we're working very closely, particularly around the Good Work mission. We are looking to set up a series of mayoral academies focusing on the key sectors that we think are needed to support London's recovery. Green industries, digital and hospitality. And all of those sectors share similarities in terms of high vacancy rates, skills shortages, and in some cases, just a general lack of awareness that these jobs exist and that you can actually go into some really exciting opportunities. Green industries, I think, is the one where we all talk about green. What do we actually mean by those jobs? And we will be defining that further with the Academies programme. The academies in themselves will provide funding for a range of things, a quality mark for our provision, where we know that provision is excellent and meets the standards suitable for those sectors. It will provide funding for hubs, which will effectively be groups of employers, skills providers, HE providers in some instances, Department for Work and Pensions and other employability and skills brokerage services to come together and work collectively either on a particular geographic location or, for example, in a particular sector across London. We've had some significant support from employers around this, and we're really keen to work across that as it rolls out. We're also hoping that there'll be some capital funding available to support some of that activity, and also the importance of the convening power of the mayor of bringing together some of these sectors to start to work together on some of those areas. One of the other things we've done as well, and we will be launching in the next few weeks, is something called the No Wrong Door, which almost started as a bit of a joke. I think we called it the No Wrong Door and it stuck. So now we talk about this No Wrong Door all the time. But essentially what that's trying to do is working with our borough partners, working with the Department for Work and Pensions in particular, is to try and join up all the entry points. It's a really complex system. All of us working in this area know how complex it is. We've been talking about this, I think, for as long as I've ever worked in this. And so we're not unaware of the huge, ambitious nature of saying any Londoner that needs a job can knock on any door and we'll join it up and make it happen for you. But what I would say is the pandemic has absolutely brought together the key objectives of boroughs, the GLA and the Department for Work and Pensions in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. And now we are collectively working together to ensure this happens. And whilst incredibly ambitious, we're very keen to make sure that this works. And again, we've got some funding that will be supporting those activities and those hubs across London. The other things we've done as well, recognising that the adult education budget that no one's sort of mentioned so far is absolutely key and a cornerstone of recovery in London. We know we need skilled people. We know that we need to be focusing on some of those entry-level skills. We talked earlier about people furthest away from the labour market before the pandemic are now possibly even further away, and we can't forget about those people. So how do we make sure that we're utilising the funding that we have available to really support them and drive them through on a journey through, hopefully, eventually to employment? And we're looking we've used some of our funding. We had £32 million, which has been announced this week, going out focusing on 4 or 5 of our key sectors of recovery to get more skills training provision in to support jobs and Londoners as well. So I think I've probably spoken for long enough, but I think there's loads of things we can do. And I think the pandemic has really brought together the local authorities, GLA in London, with other government departments, in particular DWP in this instance, to work together in a way I haven't seen before. And I think the value of that to national government is significant. What we can do really well in a locality is join up the dots. For me, it's not necessarily about more devolution. I think devolution isn't necessarily the right word. It's about making sure that the funding is available, whether it's at national level or not, but that funding is joined together at a local level to really maximise that impact. And I suppose the final thing I would say for London is we're hugely conscious of the levelling up agenda. We wouldn't argue that other parts of the country need funding to support their economies, but we are very conscious that there shouldn't be a levelling down to London as well. And I think that's probably where I'll stop.
Brilliant, thank you, Michelle. And a couple of common themes there. You and Shona have both highlighted the importance of working collectively in during the pandemic and the recovery, and interesting points as well about kind of high vacancy rates and skills shortages, which I'd like to come back to in the Q&A. Just before I hand to Sarah, if I can remind everybody to, if you've got questions, comments, please post those in the chat, and we'll open up to those questions shortly. So Sarah, if I can come to you next. Sarah is Head of Policy and Research at Reed in Partnership. Really interested to hear your view as an employment support provider and as part of the kind of wider Reed group. What's your view on the kind of local impacts of the pandemic? And quite interested to hear your perspective on how some of the support for job seekers in rural areas might vary from those in city areas.
Thanks, Naomi. My job involves a lot picking up on particular kind of issues or challenges that are significant for people using our services, or how we can understand something a bit more in depth so that we can deliver the service better. And one issue that we have been looking at recently is this issue of how to better support people in rural parts of the country coming out of the pandemic. And I thought it might be useful in answering your questions to kind of pick up a couple of points that have come out of that, and some learning points to take forward as well. Obviously that issue of rurality is a really big issue for us as we're delivering Restart in some very rural areas of the northeast and the southeast of England as well, but also crucially so I think I do want to mention the work and health programme that primarily serves disabled people and those with long-term health conditions, because I want to make sure we keep talking about these services particularly that are focused on disabled people, as well as the big focus on Restart at the moment. But the things I want to pick up on, I wanted to get a bit of a closer, more local grip on where kind of pockets of the worst impacts of the pandemic have been in rural areas. So I did a bit of analysis looking at lowest input area levels, so a kind of very small neighbourhood level of between 1,000 and 3,000 people, and looking at that by rurality or whether they were very urban places. And I mean, as Michelle has said, talking about London and the cities more generally, where the claimant count in February had gone very high, sort of above 1 in 10 people, unemployment claimants, that 99% of those tiny areas, LSOAs, were in cities. So we are seeing a terribly hard hit city population from the pandemic, and undoubtedly. But when you look at the more rural areas, it's these kind of smaller rural hub towns that don't they're kind of often smaller than the market town kind of definition, sort of rural towns and their fringes, and people on the poorly connected bits outside towns, particularly in places like County Durham, Northumberland, Tendring in Essex, Cornwall, bits of Yorkshire, Shropshire, the Isle of Wight. And I mean, the striking thing about those places is that they are the ones that come up. They'll be familiar with anyone who's read other sort of left behind places reports, particularly the work the Big Local has done on their community needs index around transport and digital connectivity. Exactly the same places that did have issues before the pandemic. Those problems have got worse, and that we really do need to prioritise. So the second learning point, I guess, is partly from some survey work pre and post pandemic we've been doing with our frontline advisors and those of our partners, which is what's the big difference? What's the big barrier in rural areas? And unsurprisingly, transport. I mean, it's just such a key one, that people can get a bus. It's stopping people. 92% of our advisors said that they'd worked with a participant who was unable to go for or accept a job because of transport difficulties, because they can't get there. And this is obviously a really long-standing issue. But I think we really need to take that kind of partnership work around transport to a new level, because I think we really need to put labour market planning at the heart of transport planning. And we've got some really big opportunities, I guess, over the coming months. We've got the government's new bus strategy. There's already loads of great work going on this issue with local authorities and combined authorities, to try and match up labour market needs and transport planning. Could we get employers more involved in this? That's one of the things I'll be seeking to do, working with our Restart people over the coming months. Could we get more dialogue about, for a bigger employer, say like Amazon, there can be a business case to get more involved in sustainable employee transport, because they're recruiting large numbers of people, they're growing, they may be setting up a big site, and I know they've done so in County Durham and Northumberland, to get involved in those bus routes and how they work for their workers. But could we support smaller employers club together to do that more? Can we look at more? They've got to be cost-effective solutions. You can be talking about supporting quite small numbers of people who need to get to those workplaces. So really, that's my kind of. I think that's the action point that I really take out of this report to work on, is around transport. And secondly, just the more broader point, as Shona and others have said, it's about partnership collaboration at local level, and we're very happy to be involved in supporting those communities. I think in rural areas particularly, it's also about supporting smaller organisations working locally, like community transport organisations, village halls, to make sure we help them have a sustainable future by intertwining the ways in which we deliver, and again providing that no wrong door, just as relevant in rural areas as urban, but tricky logistically because of transport. The other connectivity issue is obviously digital, but from most of the work, we're talking to our advisors about that. It so often does come down to affordability. So it's not just the rural broadband issue, it is an affordability issue of devices, which we see very much in urban areas as well. So I don't think that's as distinctly rural, but the transport one is the nut that we really need to crack. A third thing I'd just like to squeeze in is about supporting job seekers in rural areas, is just that we need to really optimise how we use a kind of hybrid person-centred approach to support job seekers. So we know we can't see digital support as a separate thing anymore. We've got to see it about what does this individual need in terms of the kind of remote and face-to-face option. Obviously face-to-face is really crucial, but I think we've learned a lot over the past few months about the potential to help job seekers in rural areas spend some really kind of impactful time on activities rather than sitting on a bus with things that work in that way. Say, for instance, on our jet service, we've had thousands of participants. The majority of participants have taken part in kind of group wellbeing workshops that have they've been really successful in terms of the impact that participants are saying they've had to support them and their mental health and wellbeing during this time. So yeah, I'll end there. Actually, can I just make one other point, which is about employers again in rural areas? We also want to work with employers to encourage them to look at more flexible working and potentially home working, not just for professional roles, because we know throughout this pandemic we've seen a lot of home working from professionals, and of course the majority of the participants we support are going into frontline roles where they need to be there, in health and care, in retail and so on. But are there lower skilled and more entry-level roles that we could have more detailed conversation with employers about flexibility and about home working? So yeah, please do pick up with me individually if there's anything in there that you want to talk about in areas where we work locally. Great.
And some really important points about the impacts and barriers across different types of area. And a reminder that it's not just about employment and skills, but transport has a huge role to play in connecting people to job opportunities and helping drive the recovery. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Paul, just picking up Sarah's point about the kind of differential kind of impacts across, you know, cities versus towns and rural areas and some of the barriers. Can you talk a bit about how you see kind of cities and towns and their role in kind of driving the recovery? And a question from a member of the audience about you talked about local government reorganisation earlier. What kind of reorganisation do you think is necessary to address some of the challenges that we see?
Great, thanks, Naomi. So, as people probably have noticed over recent years, there's been quite a polemic sort of cities v towns debate that's been going on, which is just deeply unhelpful, I think I would say. And there are interesting sort of stats that come out when you look at or you sort of challenge the view. I think one is, as Sarah was suggesting earlier, and indeed Naomi, work that you've done at the Learn and Work Institute as well, shows that a lot of people claiming count are based within cities. The increase that we've seen have been disproportionately based in cities as well, and that's because for people who are low skilled, cities are, I guess I would phrase it as being the least worst place for them to live. In that, if you live within a city and haven't got very much money or unemployed, actually having all those public amenities on your doorstep, which you can get a bus to or walk to, or having those jobs much closer where you don't need a car to get access to, is better than, say, being based out in a deep lying rural area. And I think that's in part why we see this split. But I think it gets us into a position of say, you know, where the debate is at the moment is that, you know, cities are all fantastic and towns are being left behind. And the reality is that just isn't the case. You know, what you see is that there are strong performing cities, but poorly performing cities, and you see exactly the same with towns as well. But what's interesting, I think, is the link between them, in that you tend to find that that towns that do well are close to a strong performing city, and towns that don't do so well are close to poorly performing cities. And that tells you something about the nature that if we are going to see perhaps some of those towns turn around, then it in part is going to be about trying to get the bigger city next door to turn around as well. And not only will that be good for the town itself, but actually really good for those people who are based in those cities that either unemployed or are in low paid jobs or their particular challenges. And those people, as I say, sort of disproportionately locate within cities. Now, the big challenge I think the UK economy has is that we know there's a north-south divide. You know, long existing policies being trying to break that for at least 80 years, if not longer. But if we look at the causes of that north-south divide, what we see is it's principally due to the underperformance of Manchester, Glasgow and Birmingham in particular. You know, not only do these three cities punch well below their weight, because they're really big places, that underperformance multiplied by their size means that you've got a really big problem. And you have a lot of people living in those areas in particular that have got very large unemployment challenges. Now, going and saying making an investment in Hartlepool to improve Hartlepool is the right thing to do if policy can do it, but there's two challenges there. The first is that if the policy is successful, it's only going to affect a relatively small number of people. So we need to bear that in mind, that if you only have a towns policy and not a city policy, how many people are you affecting? And then secondly, I think we have to be a little bit circumspect perhaps about the role that policy has got in bringing particularly high paid jobs to smaller areas, given the nature of what high skilled businesses are looking for in particular, which then gets you into questions around transport, as Sarah raised, about how you then link people to jobs in their wider local area, rather than necessarily promising them that those jobs will be on their doorstep, which the current government has done, previous governments have done, but actually we haven't got a very good track record in terms of trying to do that. So it's understanding the relationship between cities and towns rather than pitching them one via the other, but also noting that actually, the performance of towns is partly related to cities. And if we only make, for political reasons, investment in towns and don't tackle the city issue, then towns will continue to struggle, or the ones that do struggle will continue to struggle. In terms of local government reorganisation, I mean, what we are, I can't remember the exact number now, is it 346 local authorities across England, or it's close to that number, which is an incredible amount. Certainly less than what we had in 1911, and we were looking at this very recently, where across England and Wales, I think there were about, was it 1,800, I think we saw. And there clearly has been quite a lot of local government rationalisation from that period. So we've got history, we've got form for reorganising local government. But I think given that the way the economy has changed, people can travel longer distances now because of cars and increase of light rail travel, etc., etc. The footprint of economies has grown, and I think local government needs to continue to adapt to that, to make sure that local government boundaries reflect the geography of local economies. Otherwise, we're going to have all this chopping up of economic policy. And so let me give you an example of that, because the best way to view it, it's perhaps the most extreme, but it's certainly the most interesting. If you look at the city of Nottingham from the air, or you go on Google Maps and you draw a pen mark around the satellite view, you'll draw your pen line through 9 different local authorities. That's 7 local authorities, which is either the unitary of Nottingham or the districts around Nottingham, because we chop up Nottingham into loads of different pieces. And then you've got 2 counties that sit above the majority of those districts as well. That's pretty crazy. 9 local authorities for one city. Now, if I give you an example, let's say Nottingham redevelops its Broadmarsh area of the centre of its city, which is trying to do currently, had some bad news about that recently, and it's going to put some jobs in there. Let's then say that the people who are going to do those jobs are going to move into housing, let's say in neighbouring Gedling, which is still very much within the built-up footprint of Nottingham. So Nottingham City Council does the jobs in the centre, and then does the transport to the edge of Nottingham Local Authority. Then the district does the housing, but then the county does the transport from those houses to Nottingham City Council's border. Now, it may be that all those things fit together and it's all perfect, maybe, but the probability is that it's not, because there's so many different organisations trying to achieve perhaps different things rather than having one plan and having all that consolidated. So our recommendations are that we should see consolidation and reorganisation of local government, taking us down from that 350-ish figure to something more like 69, which is a very large rationalisation. And then you put a or you put a directly elected mayor at the top of that pyramid, so that actually every voter in that area votes for that mayor, and they are directly accountable in the way that we do see for some of the metro mayors that have been put in place already, rather than the existing model of local government, which is the party decides the leader amongst the councillors, of which the councillors get elected in on one local authority, on one ward of one local authority. So even people within one local authority, and we'd see those changes. I think with that, then you remove duplication, you increase your pool result in a more attractive place to work as well, which makes talent attraction and retention better too, which then means that local government can do so much more than what is the case currently with its chopped up powers that it currently has, as well as all the stuff that it should have, which it doesn't have already. Now, I appreciate that is controversial, and there are people who will not want that to happen. But I think what we're trying to say is that match local government boundaries to the economy, will empower local government and allow it to do so much more, be able to do its job so much better than it currently does, and we'll see better outcomes as a result.
Great, thank you, Paul. And potentially addresses some of the complexities that the other panelists have talked about, particularly in across local areas and with national government schemes as well. Sarah and Shona, perhaps I come to you first. Another question about what's being done at local levels in terms of providing opportunities in the recovery to marginalised communities, people, particularly thinking about disabled and deaf people, many of whom may have been pushed kind of further from the labour market as a result of the pandemic. We know from our research at Learning and Work that was published last month that disabled people have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Are there things that you can do and are doing within Tees Valley, Shona, to support these people and people that have been particularly impacted?
Yes, thank you, Naomi. I think there's a lot of work that was probably ongoing in areas of deprivation in terms of unemployment and employment pre-COVID that actually need to be built upon because they become even more in demand now in terms of access and the numbers of people that need that support. So, for example, the DWP innovation pilots that we're running, or indeed in some areas are continuing to run, certainly ours is still running, which was about looking at those people with protected characteristics or people who are marginalised in the labour market or most distant from the labour market. What should we do to help those people? And in effect, it's about creating a care worker or a key worker or indeed a mentor around that person that can help them, going back to some previous points, navigate the system, access all the different ranges of support that's out there, but also understand the needs of that individual, being very responsive to any changing needs and being able to solve their issues and remove the barriers as quickly as possible. But then also being almost an advocate for that person when they're talking to employers. So really encouraging employers to respond positively to, if you like, give people a chance that they might not have given a chance to if they just basically went out to the normal routes of recruitment. And I think there's an education to employers here to look at people who are marginalised or disabled, who have a real worth within society. And I'll actually, in a lot of cases, with some very small tweaks, can be even more productive than maybe people that an employer would consider more able-bodied. So I think that's a really important piece of work to engage and communicate and educate employers to really respond to this. And we are actually seeing a lot of our employers respond really well. One method is by using social value through procurement and funding opportunities. So where our combined authority is procuring any of the activities, particularly around the new development site of Tees Works, we are putting a 20% threshold in terms of scoring for social value commitments when people are bidding into those procurement opportunities. And that's a really useful way of getting contractors to commit to addressing the kind of employment skills issues that we have within a locality, and employing disabled people, working with disabled organisations, supporting those organisations both financially and in time is actually really important. But then also us acting as advocates to show the difference that an employer can make to people's lives if they are marginalised or have multiple barriers to employment. And I think we're certainly doing a lot of work around this. There's numerous projects. There's still European social funded projects. The new Restart programme that is coming in is built on that model. And we're working with Read in Partnership and the subcontractors to really make sure that that really dovetails and aligns with everything else that's going on within our organisation and beyond. So I think probably there's a lot more we can do, and there's probably a lot more that is needed to be done, because, as you say, this group of people have been impacted by COVID-19, and I think the demand will increase for this kind of support. And I think we should probably add in the point here about mental health. And actually, I think mental health isn't, the obvious, I'll call it a disability, although it's probably the wrong term to use, but it is a health condition that is often hidden, and the impact of COVID-19 on individuals and mental health is really significant. And therefore, I think we need to think of that as an item that we have to really take into consideration when we're helping people. And that is going to be really important for employability projects moving forward.
Great. Okay. And if there was one thing, I'm going to ask all the panelists, if there was one thing you would want the government to prioritise over the coming months to help Tees Valley and local authorities deal with the kind of, the economic impacts of the pandemic and drive the recovery, what would be your top priority?
I think it's about enabling flexibility of all the current programmes that we've got. We have got a lot of support out there, there's no doubt about it. But I think at the moment it is about being flexible and responsive to the individual needs and also the business needs. And that's the greatest thing that we've seen really works, particularly for marginalised people. So the DWP Innovation Pilot has enabled us to test that. And it has been an incredible programme, and as they continues to run. We are looking to expand it further once DWP finishes in terms of their contribution, but clearly working with Restart will be really important there. But yeah, really thinking through, often a lot of employment skills programs have really strict eligibility criteria, they have really strict conditions about when someone can engage, and if they disengage that they can't re-engage, and it's really funding driven or target driven in terms of numbers. And I think if we could try and soften that target-driven and funding-driven system to be much more responsive to local need, I think that would be incredible.
Great. Okay. And Sarah, come to you quickly. We've got about 3 minutes left. But just on that point about marginalised communities and the impacts on kind of disabled people in particular, you talked about the kind of impacts on rural areas, but you also mentioned the work and health programme. What more do you think should be done to support disabled people, others who have been particularly impacted, and what would be your top priority for government in terms of supporting local economies?
Well, that's really hard to answer. I've already got on about buses enough, and we are getting more funding on that. I would just focus, like Shona has said, about mental health. I mean, the need is just astounding, isn't it, in terms of support needs from young people through to older people, disabled people in particular, who will have many of whom will have so many concerns and worries and flexibility is needed and help at the moment needed. We are getting the announcement soon from the government, aren't we, I think, on the National Disability Strategy and a white paper as well, which hopefully will have some good news on improvements to sick pay, which I think would be a really good thing. Yeah, mental health, resources and support is the one I'd put first. Great.
Okay, and Michelle, I'll give you the last word. Really interesting to hear you talk about the GLA's work on the no wrong door policy, particularly given what we've talked about in terms of the complexity of the system, but actually the importance of just being able to engage people in the support that's available. What would be your top priority?
a priority from government to help out? Well, I suppose I think it goes back to what Shona has said, and also Sarah, it's the flexibility to join up these things at a local level. I don't think there's any doubt that locally, and I'm not actually talking probably at a GLA level, I'm talking at a local authority level, where you are having direct contact with residents, that we can do these things better if we work together. So my ask of government would be that they give us the flexibility to join these things up well at a local level. And to give us the freedom to be able to do that. We're doing that with what we've got, but we are challenged by some of the restrictions, and it would be great if we could be given, I suppose, a little bit of a free pass to make this work, because it hits the government's objectives. We're not competing, we're just doing it at a local level.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. So with that, we are out of time. So thank you very much to each of our panelists for your contributions this afternoon. It's been a really interesting discussion. Lots there on how we deal with these issues of complexity and how we actually join the system up better and enable local government to have that kind of long-term certainty and more flexibility to actually deal with some of the impacts of the pandemic and drive the recovery. So thank you very much, and thank you to our audience too for joining us, and we'll leave it there.